Warning! This episode of Data and Dissonance contains long-form political discussion, conflicting viewpoints, and honest disagreement. Nothing you're about to hear is designed to convert you, shame you, or hand you a script to repeat online. This show exists for people who are tired of headlines yelling at them, tired of narratives being flattened into slogans, and tired of being told who they're allowed to listen to. On Fridays especially, we create space for conversations that don't fit cleanly into partisan boxes. Because real life doesn't either. If hearing a perspective you disagree with makes you angry, defensive, or uncomfortable, that's not a flaw in the episode. That's the work. Listener discretion advised, not because this is extreme, but because it's honest.
We live in a moment where everybody is convinced they're right, everybody is convinced the other side is evil, and nobody seems remotely interested in asking why someone thinks the way they do. Every issue gets reduced to a meme. Every disagreement becomes a moral indictment, and every conversation is treated like a battleground instead of an exchange. That's great for algorithms, terrible for a country, and completely useless if the goal is understanding what's actually happening beneath the noise. Fridays on Data and Dissonance are where we slow that whole mess down. No breaking news panic, no rage bait, no performative outrage, just time, context, and uncomfortable questions. Today's episode is one of those conversations, not because we're pretending there aren't real disagreements, and definitely not because we're pretending everyone secretly agrees. It's because if you only ever listen to voices that confirm what you already believe, you're not informed, you're insulated. So today, we're doing something simple but increasingly rare. We're letting someone from the other side of the aisle speak in full sentences, finish their thoughts, and explain how they see the world without turning them into a cartoon villain. This is Special Guest Friday, and today it's Skylar's turn. Fridays on Data and Dissonance are where we take our foot off the gas just enough to actually hear each other think. This isn't about scoring points, clipping a viral moment, or setting traps. It's about understanding how people arrive at the conclusions they hold, especially when those conclusions don't line up with our own. If the only voices you ever hear are the ones you already agree with, you're not sharpening your ideas, you're just reinforcing them. That's not what this show is built for. Today we're spotlighting Skylar. She comes at the world from a progressive Green Party-leaning perspective with a heavy focus on environmental issues, healthcare, and how policy decisions land on everyday people instead of think tanks or cable news panels. She's not here to represent a party machine, and she's not here to shout over anyone. She's here to explain how she sees the system, where she thinks it's failing, and why she believes the priorities she does. You don't have to agree with her to get value out of this conversation, but you do have to let her finish a thought before deciding she's wrong. The format today is simple and intentional. I'll ask real questions, not gotchas. Skylar will answer in full, not in sound bites. I'll push back where I disagree, follow up where clarity matters, and we'll keep moving forward without rushing or sanitizing the tension. This is a conversation, not a conversion, and the goal isn't consensus, it's understanding. Skylar, thanks for being here. Let's start at the beginning. Before we ever get into policy labels or party identities, I want to rewind this all the way back. When you think about how you became progressive, not just politically, but philosophically, what were the earliest influences that shaped how you see the world? Was it family, school, a specific moment, or something you lived through that made you start questioning the way things were supposed to work?
For me, it started less with politics and more with people. I grew up watching how differently the system treated people depending on where they lived, how much money they had, or what kind of safety net their family started with. School played a role, sure, but it was more about exposure, seeing environmental damage treated like an acceptable side effect, seeing healthcare framed as a privilege instead of a necessity, and noticing that the people most affected by those decisions rarely had a seat at the table. I didn't wake up one day and decide to be progressive. It was more that the explanations I was given for why things were the way they were stopped making sense when matched against real outcomes.
That's interesting because you're describing something a lot of conservatives also say, watching systems fail real people, but landing in a very different place philosophically. Already that split is important because it shows how the same frustration can push people in opposite directions depending on what they think the root problem actually is. Was there a moment, maybe early adulthood, where you realized, okay, this isn't just frustration anymore, this is a worldview? Something where you crossed from this feels wrong into, I actually believe the system itself needs to change?
Yeah, that moment came when I started working and paying attention to how policies translated into everyday life. Watching people work full-time jobs and still struggle to afford basic health care, seeing environmental regulations weakened in the name of short-term profit, and realizing that the long-term consequences were always deferred to later. That's when it clicked that individual effort alone wasn't enough if the structures themselves were tilted. It wasn't about hating capitalism or rejecting responsibility. It was about recognizing patterns that kept repeating regardless of who was working hardest.
And that's a key distinction you're making early, that this isn't about effort versus laziness, but about structural incentives. Conservatives hear that and worry it removes accountability, while progressives hear it and think accountability has been misdirected. That tension's going to come up a lot today. A lot of people who end up where you are started out trusting institutions, media, government, experts, and then something cracked. Did you ever have a phase where you believed the system was fundamentally good but just poorly managed before deciding it was deeper than that?
Absolutely. I didn't start from a place of distrust. I assumed institutions existed to protect people and solve problems, even if imperfectly. What changed was watching the same failures happen over and over with no meaningful correction. Environmental warnings ignored until disaster hit. Healthcare costs rising while outcomes stagnated, and politicians acknowledging problems publicly while quietly maintaining the status quo. It wasn't one scandal. It was the pattern of denial followed by half measures that never addressed root causes.
That loss of institutional trust is something both sides share, even if they blame different actors for it. What's fascinating is how progressives often respond by wanting more systemic intervention, while conservatives respond by wanting less. Same wound, different prescription. When did the Green Party lens enter the picture specifically? Because that's a smaller, more values-driven space than mainstream progressivism. What pulled you there instead of keeping you aligned with a major party?
The Green Party appealed to me because it felt less transactional and more principled, even if it came with real limitations. Environmental sustainability, healthcare as a human right, and long-term planning weren't treated as talking points. They were foundational. I knew it meant less power, less visibility, and more uphill battles, but it also meant fewer compromises that contradicted the values I cared about. For me, integrity mattered more than access.
That's a trade-off a lot of people respect, even if they disagree with the conclusions. Choosing principle over power is rare in politics and risky, but it explains why your critiques tend to come from values first, not party loyalty. Looking back now, is there anything about your early formation, anything you believed or assumed, that you'd challenge or refine today? Not abandon, but sharpen?
I'd say I've become more aware of complexity. Early on, it was easier to believe there were clean solutions being blocked by bad actors. Now I see how incentives, culture, and unintended consequences complicate everything. I still believe deeply in environmental protection and healthcare reform, but I'm more cautious about pretending one-size-fits-all solutions exist. Growth, for me, has meant holding on to values while questioning methods.
That evolution matters because it tells listeners this isn't a frozen ideology. It's a living one, and that sets the stage for where we go next. Because once beliefs form, the real question becomes what happens when reality pushes back on them. You talked in the first segment about losing trust in institutions through patterns, not scandals. I want to zoom in on that. Was there a specific moment where you realized, okay, this isn't just slow progress? This system actively resists change, something that shifted you from disappointment into skepticism?
Yes, and it came when I saw how often urgent issues were acknowledged publicly but quietly deprioritized once the spotlight moved on. Climate warnings would make headlines, commissions would be formed, and then policy would stall or be watered down until it no longer threatened economic interests. The same thing happened with healthcare reform. Lots of speeches about compassion, very little follow-through that actually reduced costs or expanded access meaningfully. That's when I realized the resistance wasn't accidental. It was structural, built into who benefits from delay.
That idea, in that delay itself becomes a strategy, is something conservatives usually accuse bureaucracy of, not ideology. But you're saying the problem isn't just red tape, it's who that red tape protects. A lot of conservatives listening would say, welcome to government. That's why we want less of it. But instead of pulling away from government solutions, you leaned harder into systemic reform. Why didn't that disillusionment push you toward decentralization or skepticism of centralized power?
Because stepping back didn't seem to reduce harm. It just shifted it. When regulation disappears, power doesn't vanish. It consolidates privately. Environmental damage still happens. Healthcare costs still rise. But now, accountability becomes even harder to pin down. I didn't see government as the only answer, but I did see it as the only tool large enough to counterbalance concentrated corporate power. For me, the question wasn't government or no government. It was, who is setting the rules and who do they answer to?
That's a fundamental fork in the road between left and right, whether government is the firewall against power or the amplifier of it. And once you choose that fork, everything downstream starts to make sense. Did you ever feel politically homeless during that transition? Like the mainstream progressive space talked about your issues, but didn't actually want to go as far as you thought was necessary?
Absolutely. There was a long stretch where it felt like being too radical for mainstream politics, but too pragmatic for activist spaces. Progressives often stop at what's electable instead of what's necessary. And that can feel like betrayal when you're watching long-term damage pile up. That sense of political homelessness was uncomfortable, but it also clarified my priorities. I stopped chasing validation and focused on coherence. Does this belief system actually align with the outcomes I want to see?
That mirrors something we hear from populists on the right, the feeling that major parties speak the language of change while protecting the same power structures. Different conclusions. Same frustration. Let's talk about media for a second. When did you realize that even outlets you mostly agreed with were still shaping narratives in ways that made you uneasy?
When complexity disappeared. I noticed that stories increasingly needed villains and heroes instead of causes and consequences. Nuance was treated as weakness, and dissent within the left was often framed as betrayal instead of debate. That was unsettling because if your side can't tolerate internal criticism, it's not actually confident in its ideas. I still consume progressive media, but I do it with a lot more skepticism than I used to.
That's a big admission, and because a lot of people only apply media skepticism outward, never inward. Once you start questioning your own side's framing, there's no going back. Looking back now, was there a personal cost to that disillusionment? Friendships, communities, certainty? Something you had to give up to stay honest with yourself?
Yes. Certainty was the biggest loss. It's comforting to believe your side has the moral high ground all the time, but that comfort comes at the cost of truth. I've lost some community along the way, especially when questioning tactics or priorities made people uncomfortable, but I've gained clarity, and that matters more to me now than belonging to a group that demands silence to maintain unity.
That's where disillusionment becomes maturity, not when you switch sides, but when you stop outsourcing your thinking to any side at all. And that sets us up for the present, because once trust breaks, the real question becomes what you build in its place. Let's bring this into the now. When you look at the current media environment, legacy outlets, social platforms, independent creators, who do you think actually has the most influence over how people understand what's happening in the country right now and why?
I think influence has fractured, but not evenly. Legacy media still sets the initial framing. What counts as important, what gets urgency, and what's ignored. While social platforms amplify emotional reactions to that framing, independent creators can challenge narratives, but they're still swimming in an ecosystem shaped by algorithms that reward outrage and simplicity. The danger is that influence isn't tied to accuracy anymore. It's tied to engagement. Whoever keeps people emotionally activated controls the conversation, even if they're wrong.
That engagement over accuracy shift is something everyone feels, regardless of ideology. The disagreement is usually about who is abusing it the most, but the mechanism itself is the same. Do you think the media is driving polarization more than politicians are? Or are they just responding to an audience that's already divided?
It's a feedback loop. Politicians perform for media, media performs for audiences, and audiences reward whoever confirms their fears or beliefs. The problem is that nobody wants to be the first one to de-escalate because calm doesn't convert clicks or votes. Media outlets could slow things down, but that would mean sacrificing market share. Politicians could tell harder truths, but that risks primary challenges. So everyone keeps pushing the volume up and blaming the crowd.
That's an uncomfortable truth for people who want a single villain. Polarization doesn't survive on one actor. It survives because it's profitable and politically useful. From your perspective, which institutions right now deserve the most skepticism from the public? Government, corporations, media, or academia? And which ones do you think conservatives unfairly distrust?
Corporations and media deserve the most skepticism because their incentives are directly tied to profit and influence, not public well-being. Government should be scrutinized, but abandoning it entirely just hands power to unaccountable private actors. I think conservatives often underestimate how much corporate lobbying shapes policy outcomes, while progressives sometimes underestimate how bureaucratic inertia can kill good ideas. Distrust should be targeted, not blanket.
Targeted distrust is hard, though. Blanket distrust is emotionally simpler, and that's where a lot of movements, left and right, end up drifting. Let's talk about trust at the individual level. Do you think the average American should trust experts anymore, scientists, economists, policy specialists, or has that relationship been permanently damaged?
I don't think expertise itself is the problem. I think unchallenged authority is. Experts provide valuable insight, but when disagreement is framed as ignorance instead of part of the scientific or policy process, trust erodes. People don't reject expertise because they hate knowledge. They reject it because they feel talked down to or excluded from decision-making. Rebuilding trust means humility, transparency, and admitting uncertainty instead of selling certainty that later collapses.
That loss of humility is something a lot of people felt during the last few years. And once credibility cracks, it's incredibly hard to restore. Right now, a lot of Americans feel like institutions don't work for them, left, right, and center. From where you sit, is that feeling justified, or is it being exaggerated for political gain?
It's justified, but it's also being exploited. Institutions often fail people quietly through complexity and delay, while political actors amplify those failures selectively to build loyalty. The danger is that legitimate frustration gets redirected toward cultural enemies instead of structural problems. When people feel unheard, they're easier to manipulate, and that's where both populism and technocracy can become dangerous in different ways.
That's the tightrope we're all walking right now. Real failure on one side, real manipulation on the other. And how we interpret that tension determines what solutions we're willing to accept. Let's start with healthcare, because it's one of the places where ideology meets reality fast. From your perspective, what is the biggest lie Americans are told about healthcare? Something that keeps real reform from ever happening?
The biggest lie is that our system is expensive because it's the best. Cost and quality get conflated, when in reality we spend more while leaving millions underinsured or one emergency away from financial collapse. The conversation is framed as innovation versus access, but that's a false choice. Other countries manage both with better outcomes and lower costs. As long as profit is treated as synonymous with efficiency, reform gets stuck before it starts.
That's where conservatives immediately worry about what happens to innovation and choice. But you're arguing the current system isn't actually delivering those benefits evenly in the first place. Environmental policy is another flashpoint. Critics say progressive climate policies punish working-class people through higher costs, while the promised benefits stay abstract or long-term. How do you answer that criticism, honestly?
It's a fair concern, and pretending otherwise is part of the problem. Poorly designed environmental policy can absolutely hurt working people, especially when costs are passed down instead of absorbed at the top. But ignoring environmental damage also hits the working class hardest through health issues, water contamination, and disaster recovery that individuals can't afford. The real failure isn't caring about the environment. It's failing to design transitions that protect people during change.
That's a distinction that rarely makes it into headlines. That harm doesn't disappear just because it's delayed or offloaded onto different communities. Let's talk economics more broadly. Conservatives argue that regulation stifles growth and innovation, while progressives argue that deregulation concentrates power. Where do you think regulation actually helps, and where does it cross the line?
Regulation helps when it sets guardrails that prevent exploitation, environmental destruction, or systemic risk, like financial crashes or health disasters. It crosses the line when it becomes disconnected from outcomes and starts protecting incumbents instead of the public. I don't think regulation should be about control. It should be about alignment, making sure private incentives don't produce public harm. The problem is that too many regulations get written by the industries they're supposed to restrain.
That's a critique conservatives usually make too, regulatory capture. But you're not using it as an argument against regulation itself, just against who controls it. One of the biggest present-day divides is how people define fairness. Do you think fairness should be measured by equal opportunity, equal outcomes, or something else entirely?
Fairness should be measured by whether people have a genuine chance to live stable, healthy lives, not by identical outcomes, but by removing artificial barriers that stack the deck early. Equal opportunity sounds good, but it's hollow if starting conditions are wildly unequal. At the same time, enforcing equal outcomes ignores human difference and agency. The balance is creating a floor that prevents collapse, not a ceiling that limits growth.
That framing, floor, not ceiling, is one of the few ways this debate can stay grounded instead of ideological. Right now, Americans are exhausted. Inflation, housing, healthcare, energy, everything feels heavier. From your seat, what policy conversation do you think politicians are avoiding because it forces them to admit uncomfortable trade-offs?
They're avoiding the conversation about limits, fiscal, environmental, and political. No one wants to admit that infinite growth on a finite planet has consequences, or that some benefits can't be expanded without asking who pays. Politicians sell painless solutions because honesty risks backlash. But avoiding those trade-offs doesn't eliminate them. It just delays the reckoning until the costs are higher and choices are narrower.
That avoidance is where public trust really erodes, not because people hate sacrifice, but because they hate being lied to about it. When you look 10 years down the road, not in campaign slogans, but in reality, what worries you the most about where the country is headed if current trends continue?
What worries me most is fragmentation. Not just political division, but social disconnection. People are increasingly sorted into economic, informational, and cultural silos, which makes empathy harder and conflict easier. If that continues, policy failures won't just hurt more, they'll feel intentional to the people affected. A country can survive disagreement, but it struggles when groups stop believing they share a future at all.
That's a fear that cuts across ideology. Once people stop believing the system includes them, they start looking for exits or enemies. What do you think conservatives underestimate most about the risks ahead? Something you wish they took more seriously, even if they rejected your solutions?
I think conservatives underestimate how environmental and healthcare failures compound over time. These aren't isolated issues. They interact with economic stress, migration, and national security. Ignoring early warning signs doesn't preserve stability. It makes disruption more sudden and more expensive later. You don't have to agree with my policies to acknowledge that prevention is cheaper than crisis response.
That's the classic maintenance versus emergency argument, and history usually sides with whoever invested earlier, even if it wasn't popular at the time. On the flip side, what do you think progressives underestimate about the future? Blind spots on your own side that could cause serious problems if left unchecked.
Progressives often underestimate cultural resistance and overestimate how fast change can happen without backlash. Good intentions don't eliminate the need for buy-in, and policy that feels imposed can harden opposition instead of solving problems. There's also a tendency to moralize disagreement, which shuts down dialogue and fuels resentment. If the left doesn't relearn persuasion, it risks losing legitimacy, even when it's right on the facts.
That admission is rare and important, because movements don't fail when they're wrong. They fail when they stop listening. Despite all of this, I want to force you into something harder. Hope. What actually gives you hope right now, even in small ways?
What gives me hope is local action. I see communities solving problems pragmatically when national politics fail. Mutual aid networks, environmental restoration projects, healthcare cooperatives. These efforts aren't glamorous, but they prove people still care about outcomes more than ideology when they're close to the problem. Hope doesn't come from institutions right now. It comes from people refusing to wait for permission to help each other.
That's a grounded kind of hope, not faith in systems, but faith in neighbors. And that resonates more than most political rhetoric. If you could redirect the national conversation toward one future-focused priority, something you think would reduce suffering regardless of party, what would it be?
I'd redirect it toward resilience. Not just economic growth, but the ability of people and systems to absorb shocks without collapsing. That means affordable healthcare, stable housing, environmental safeguards, and a social trust. Resilience isn't flashy, and it doesn't fit into election cycles, but it's what determines whether a society bends or breaks when pressure hits.
Resilience is one of those words everyone agrees with until it's time to fund it, plan for it, and defend it politically. And that's exactly why it matters. Let's start with common ground because it's rare but not imaginary. Where do you genuinely believe conservatives and progressives could work together right now if the incentives changed? Not hypothetically, but practically.
I think there's real common ground around reducing corruption and increasing transparency. Most people, regardless of ideology, believe the system favors insiders and punishes outsiders. Whether it's corporate lobbying, revolving doors, or regulatory capture, the frustration is shared even if the solutions differ. If incentives shifted away from money-driven politics, a lot of downstream trust could be rebuilt.
That's one of the few issues that consistently polls well across the spectrum, and one of the least acted on, which says a lot about who benefits from the status quo. Now the hard part, what are your red lines? The issues where compromise actually becomes harmful in your view?
Environmental collapse and access to basic healthcare are red lines for me. Compromise that delays action in these areas isn't neutral. It actively increases harm over time. I'm open to debate on methods, timelines, and implementation, but not on whether these issues deserve serious, sustained action. Some problems are too consequential to treat as bargaining chips.
That distinction, methods versus priorities, is where a lot of conversations break down before they even start. If a conservative listener came away from this episode wanting to engage you in good faith, what's the wrong way to do it? Something that guarantees the conversation goes nowhere.
Starting from bad faith assumptions. If the conversation begins with, you hate freedom or you want control, it shuts everything down. Disagreement is fine. Caricature isn't. The same applies in reverse. Conservatives aren't automatically cruel or ignorant because they prioritize markets or tradition. Productive dialogue requires assuming the other person cares about outcomes, even if you disagree on how to achieve them.
That's advice a lot of people could use, especially online, where tone gets flattened and intent is always assumed to be malicious. What do you think conservatives get right? Something your own side should acknowledge more often, even if it complicates their narrative.
Conservatives are right to worry about unintended consequences and centralized power. Rapid change without feedback can create new problems while trying to solve old ones. There's also value in tradition and social cohesion that progressives sometimes dismiss too quickly. Stability isn't inherently oppressive. It can be protective if it's inclusive.
That acknowledgement matters because no movement has a monopoly on wisdom, and pretending otherwise usually backfires. Last one. When this episode ends and people start arguing about it online, what do you hope they argue about? And what do you hope they don't miss?
I hope they argue about priorities, trade-offs, and long-term consequences instead of motives. I hope they don't miss that disagreement doesn't mean disrespect, and that listening doesn't mean surrender. If people walk away thinking a little more carefully about who pays the cost of inaction and who benefits from delay, then the conversation did its job.
That's a solid place to land. Not agreement, but awareness. And if more conversations ended there, we'd be in a very different place as a country.
Before we wrap this up, quick pause. Not to derail the conversation, but to support the work that keeps Data and Dissonance independent. If you like long-form conversations that don't fit neatly into party boxes, that don't rush people, and that actually let opposing viewpoints speak in full sentences, that independence matters. The Data and Dissonance merch store is live with shirts, hoodies, hats, mugs, and stickers built around the same idea as this show. Question narratives? Think deeper, and don't outsource your voice. No corporate sponsors steering the content, no algorithm chasing, just listener-supported work that lets us keep doing episodes like this one. If you want to check it out, the link is in the show description. Wear it, share it, or ignore it. Either way, we appreciate you being here and engaging with the conversation. Now, let's bring this home.
Conversations like this are uncomfortable by design, not because anyone said something outrageous, but because they don't fit neatly into the boxes we're used to operating in. It's easier to argue with a caricature than with a real person who can explain why they believe what they believe, acknowledge trade-offs, and still hold firm to their values. What Skylar laid out today wasn't a demand for agreement, and it wasn't a performance for applause. It was a worldview shaped by lived experience, skepticism of power, and a real concern about long-term consequences that too often get kicked down the road. You can reject her conclusions and still respect the seriousness of the questions she's asking. From my seat, I still believe deeply in personal responsibility, limited centralized power, and the danger of systems that grow faster than accountability can keep up with them. I don't suddenly trust institutions more because someone articulates their intent well, and I don't believe good intentions protect us from bad outcomes. But here's the part that matters. Dismissing concerns outright doesn't make them disappear, and pretending every critique of the system is an attack on freedom is just as lazy as pretending every defense of markets is cruelty. If we're serious about preserving what works in this country, we have to be honest about what doesn't, and honest about why people land where they do when trust breaks. What I hope people take from this episode isn't a checklist of right or wrong answers, but a reminder that the real divide isn't always left versus right. It's thoughtful versus reflexive. It's whether we're willing to sit with complexity long enough to understand it, or whether we'd rather retreat to slogans that feel good but solve nothing. You don't have to agree with Skylar. You don't have to like her conclusions. But if you listened all the way through and came away with a clearer understanding of how someone on the other side actually thinks, not how you were told they think, then this episode did exactly what it was supposed to do. That's what Special Guest Friday is about. Not softening convictions, not blurring lines, but sharpening them through exposure instead of insulation. We'll be right back to the heat next week. The headlines, the fights, the chaos. But before we do, it matters to slow down and remember that disagreement doesn't have to mean dehumanization. Thanks for spending the time. Thanks for thinking along with us. And as always, remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Today's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series, written for readers who don't trust easy answers, clean villains, or narratives that wrap themselves up too neatly. If you like today's conversation, you'll recognize the same tension in the books: power versus accountability, truth versus convenience, and the cost of asking the questions you're not supposed to ask. Start with the Covenant Protocol, continue into the Prophet Directive, and then pick up Black Echo Rising, where the stakes get higher, the lines get blurrier, and the consequences finally catch up. These aren't political manifestos. They're fast-paced, grounded thrillers built around the idea that truth is rarely simple and almost never comfortable. And if you want something to listen to after the mic goes cold, check out Uncaged. Music available anywhere you stream. It's raw, unapologetic, and built for people who think for themselves and don't need permission to push back. Links to the books and the music are in the show description. Supporting them helps keep Data and Dissonance independent, long-form, and free to have conversations like the one you just heard.